Once upon a time. Yeah, we all know how the stories are supposed to begin. But what if I told you the fairy tales you grew up with, the ones that always wrapped up with a neat, happily ever after, were hiding a much, much darker secret? What if the stories we think we know are just the cleaned up, sanitized versions of something way more shocking? Well, today we're pulling back the curtain on that secret history. So on one side, you've got this, the image we all recognize, right? The handsome prince, the beautiful sleeping princess, the whole storybook fantasy. But then, there's the other side, something a lot more ominous, a lot more complicated. This is really the heart of what we're digging into today, the fairy tale you think you know versus the brutal reality of where it all began. And that brings us to the big question, doesn't it? What if that tidy little happily ever after wasn't really the point at all? What if it was actually a deliberate cover-up, something added later to hide a much more disturbing truth? To really get this, you have to understand that these stories, well, they weren't always for kids. They bubbled up from old oral traditions and were first written down back in the 17th century, mostly as entertainment for adults. It was only much later that they got this kid-friendly makeover. I mean, you know these names, right? Sleeping Beauty, Rapunzel, Little Red Riding Hood. The princess who pricked her finger, the girl with the ridiculously long hair, the kid in the red cloak off to see her grandma. But trust me, the original versions of these tales are filled with stuff that is absolutely not for children. All right, this is where things get really wild. We're going to start peeling back the layers, all the censorship and rewrites from over the centuries, to get to the shocking first drafts of these classics. You might want to brace yourselves. First up, The Princess, The Curse, and the 100-Year Nap. We all know how this one ends, right? True love's kiss. Or maybe not. Okay, so check this out. In the earliest version we have, an Italian story from 1634 called Sun, Moon, and Talia, there is no magical kiss. Instead, a king finds the sleeping princess, assaults her, and then just leaves. And it gets worse. She actually becomes pregnant and gives birth to twins, Sun and Moon, all while she's still completely unconscious. The only reason she wakes up is because one of her babies accidentally sucks the cursed flax splinter out of her finger. And the way these early stories handled things is just jarring. I mean, listen to this observation from one of our sources. The story treats this absolutely horrific event so casually. Talia just wakes up, finds she has 2 kids, and ends up marrying the king later on. There's no sense of trauma or violation. To us now, it's just profoundly disturbing. And this wasn't just a one-off thing. This focus on a pretty brutal reality over romance shows up again and again. So let's untangle our next story, the girl with the long hair, locked away in that tower. So in the versions we know, the witch finds out about the prince because Rapunzel slips up and mentions him. But in the original French version from the 17th century, Percinet, the reason is way more adult. The witch figures out the secret because Rapunzel's clothes are suddenly getting too tight. Her crime wasn't being careless, it was premarital sex and getting pregnant. But it was so much more than just a story about sex. The original is this really complex tale about female power dynamics. When you break it down, it's really about 3 key women: her birth mother, who gives her up, the witch, who acts as a possessive mother figure, and Rapunzel herself, who has to escape and learn to be a mother on her own in the wild. Okay, and finally, let's get to maybe the most famous fairy tale of all time. The girl, the wolf, the woods, you know the one. But the version you know is just a shadow of the original. So the biggest change, the part we all remember, is the rescue. The heroic woodsman who bursts in at the last second. Yeah, forget about him. In the earliest folk versions of this story, he just doesn't exist. There is no rescue. Nobody saves her. So what happened instead? Well, the first versions are just a sequence of pure horror. The wolf tricks the girl into eating her own grandmother's remains. Then he has her perform a striptease and get into bed with him. And then he eats her. That's it. The end. It was a brutal, terrifying cautionary tale about sexual predators. So after hearing all that, you're probably wondering, where do these characters even come from? Like, why is there always an angry, powerful woman, a wicked fairy, an evil witch, right at the center of the story? Turns out, the answer goes way, way back to ancient mythology. Just look at this timeline. You can literally trace the evil fairy all the way back 1,000 years to rituals for the 3 fates, the goddesses who controlled every person's destiny. Then, in a 14th century story, it's the actual goddess of destiny who gets mad about a missing knife at a party and curses a baby. Fast forward to 1697, and that all-powerful goddess has been shrunk down into a petty old fairy who's furious because she didn't get the same fancy gold cutlery as the other guests. And that number 3, it's everywhere in these stories. It's not a coincidence. It represents the 3 Greek fates who literally spun, measured, and cut the thread of life. It symbolizes the stages of life: childhood, adulthood, old age. And remember, it even lines up perfectly with the 3 central women in the Rapunzel story. This is some deep, ancient mythological DNA we're talking about. So if the originals were this dark and complex, how on earth did we end up with the happily ever after versions we have today? Well, that brings us to the great fairy tale cleanup crew, a very conscious effort to rewrite these stories for a totally new purpose. And when you look at the changes side by side, the pattern is just crystal clear. Sexual assault gets replaced by a sweet, chaste kiss. A cannibalistic wife gets downgraded to a mean mother-in-law. A woman's sexuality is no longer the issue. Now it's just about simple disobedience. And maybe the most telling change of all, a heroine who is eaten is rewritten to be a helpless victim who needs a man to save her. And this was totally intentional. Writers like Charles Perrault and later the famous brothers Grimm went through these stories and systematically scrubbed them. They took out the explicit violence and especially the female sexuality, and instead they injected the lessons they thought were more appropriate. Lessons about female purity, passivity, and why it's important to obey patriarchal authority.
But that kind of raises a big question, right? If the stories were changed so drastically, why do they still have such an incredible grip on our imaginations? The answer, it turns out, is in the powerful metaphors that are still lurking just under the surface.
I think this image says it all, really. At their very core, fairy tales are a kind of map. They're a symbolic guide to help us navigate the dark, scary, and confusing forest of growing up. Just think about the symbols. The spindle's prick that draws blood, it's not just a random curse, it's a pretty clear metaphor for the start of puberty. That 100-year sleep, that's basically adolescence, that weird, confusing, inward-looking time of waiting and changing. The wolf? Well, he's the obvious symbol for predators and the dangers of the world. And that thorny hedge the prince has to fight through, that is the difficult, painful journey into adulthood. These stories give us a way to process life's biggest and scariest transitions. And so we're left with this one last thought. The fairy tales we inherit aren't set in stone. They've always been changed to reflect the values of the people telling them, which, of course, makes you wonder, as our own values keep evolving, what will the fairy tales of our time look like? And 100 years from now, what will they say about us?